1967 when it all began. And that's a photo from the first show, and you can see, and maybe we can lower the lights in the room just a little bit so everybody can see the screen. But you can see what the first show looked like. A few televisions highlighting, 27-inch televisions if we were lucky. And then over 40-plus years, we've seen a lot of things introduced at CES. Many of those going nowhere, but many at the same time becoming very strong, successful commercial products. You can think about the VCR, the DVD player, the TV, of course. Very few things are owned by 90+% of households. If you take a look at mature markets like the US and Europe, over 90% of households own devices like VCRs, they own devices like televisions, increasingly they own devices like mobile phones. So outside of all other industries, consumer electronics has seen a phenomenal success story among consumers with respect to adoption. And many of those introductions have taken place at CES. Many of the ones to come will take place over the next few days. We expect 20,000 plus new products to launch over 4 short days next week, and you'll get a chance to see many of those hands-on. I want to spend just a minute in stepping back over the last 2 years to talk about a few of the trends that we identified heading into those shows and then ultimately what we saw come out of those events. These were the trends that we talked about in 2010, headed into 2010. We talked about how television was going beyond HD, and you'll see some of the things that we ultimately saw introduced. We talked about new screen sizes, devices showing up with a multitude of screen sizes. One of the reasons why I want to step back and take a look at 2010 and 2011 is because there are very strong evolutionary patterns when it comes to technology. And so what you're going to see at the 2012 International CES is building off of what has already taken place over the last several years, ultimately going all the way back to 1967. We talked about how content was evolving, that consumers were becoming taking more control over their content and having the ability to adjust their content. So we're going from a push model to a pull model, and all of that was taking place across the device ecosystems. Some of the things we saw launch in 2010, we saw 3D, of course, take the main stage here at CES. We talked about those screens showing up in a plethora of devices, and we saw a multitude of e-readers launch in 2010. We saw the first introductions of tablet-like devices. At the time, we were referring to them, for the most part, as slate devices. This was pre-launch of the iPad, so at this point in time, the beginning of 2010, we had yet to see a commercially viable, commercially successful tablet-like product, but we started to see some of those products introduced here at CES in 2010. I mentioned content and how consumers were taking control of content. We saw the Boxy Box launch, which was just one of the many devices that launched at CES, enabling consumers to take control over their content, moving again from a push model to a pull model. And that has pretty broad implications for technology generally, and certainly I think it has very specific implications for what you'll see in 2012. We saw the introduction of the AR drone, early prototypes of the AR drone that would let you control a device using another device, namely an iPhone or a smartphone. And this is something that has continued to influence the technology that we see launch at CES. We started to see large phones. We started to see devices scale very specific features. So in this instance, LG launched a phone that was 4.3 inches. At the time, a very large, excuse me, actually 4.8 inches. So at the time, a very large form factor for a phone. But we started to scale those different form factors and scale very specific attributes to these features. And that has implications for what you'll see happen in 2012. And then, of course, we saw Microsoft launch a product that they referred to as Natal, which ultimately became Kinect later that year, becoming the fastest launching consumer electronics products in the history of the consumer electronics industry. So a very quick launch for that product. Now moving on to 2011 and some of the trends that we talked about on this stage last year. We talked about portable and pocketable devices and how those were influencing the devices that we would carry. Early on, if you remember when tablets first started to launch, one of the big complaints among media and analysts was that it wasn't anything more than just a very large mobile phone. In many instances, it was running the same OS as that mobile device, and so it really wasn't, the argument at that time was it wasn't anything more than just a big mobile phone. My argument at that time was that it scaled one attribute and did it very well. It gave the end user more real estate, and so it took that device and provided a differentiated experience, and so it would be successful within a segment of the population who was looking to scale that very specific feature. And so as you look at the 2012 International CES and the projects that launched, one of the things I would look at is what feature set is being scaled, what attributes of the product are being scaled, how is it differentiating itself from what's already out there, and is there a segment of the market that's interested in having the ability to scale that particular feature, whether it's real estate, whether it's some other attribute to the device. We talked about sensorization of consumer tech. These devices were building in more sensors. If you look back at the history of our industry, one of the things you will see is that we tend to waste things when they become inexpensive. When they move from a scarcity to a surplus, we begin to waste them. So you can think back to the Macintosh when it was launched in 1984, the first commercially successful computer to have a to use graphical user interface. Before then, it had really been unheard of and would have been almost unwelcome to have a computer waste computing power by having a graphical user interface. Ultimately, the device was wasting computer power on something that it didn't need to waste it on. But computer power had gotten to the point that it was inexpensive enough. It moved from a scarcity to abundance, and so we could waste it. My argument on this stage last year was that we were moving to that place with sensors. We were moving to a place where they had gone from expensive to inexpensive. They had gone from a scarcity to a surplus, and therefore could be wasted in devices. I talked about the Microsoft Kinect, which was and it still is today, holds the record for the fastest launching consumer electronics product. It has built into it 3 cameras, 4 microphones, and a accelerometer. It is a plastic box of sensors. And so we're going to see more of those type of devices. We talked a little bit about it last year, and that's something to come. We also talked about a trend we referred to as from amplification to application, how apps were starting to take and play a main role here at CES. And what we meant by that at the time was the fact that historically you had devices that were running apps, whether they be smartphones, tablets, or other devices, but they didn't necessarily need those apps to perform their tasks. Those devices operated in isolation. You could have apps that ran on a smartphone or a tablet, and vice versa. You could have tablets that ran apps or smartphones that ran apps. What we started to see in 2010 and 2011 was the introduction of other elements of hardware combining with that app ecosystem. So combining with the smartphone or tablet and that app to create a different experience. The AR drone is an example where you have the additional hardware piece. So you had an app and a smartphone together with this hardware piece. And we saw a variety of those launch last year, and I'll talk just briefly about some of those things. Of course, the big hardware story last year was tablets. We had announced very early that we expected 100+ tablets to launch at CES, and we saw more than 100 tablets revealed for the first time here at CES last year. We had a plethora of smartphones launched last year at CES, and I think that's an important trend to watch with respect to CES more generally, certainly going back to the 40+ year history. I would argue that last year was perhaps the strongest wireless show within CES that we've had in that 40+ year history, and I expect this year, the 2012 CES, to have a stronger wireless presence than ever before. I expect more phones to launch this year than in any prior year.